Welcome to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. This is a podcast that explores a public health approach to improving the mental health of Black boys while challenging the negative stereotypes often associated with this demographic in the society. This is a happiness research-informed podcast themed on the 8 pillars of happiness explored on my research trip to the top 5 happiest countries in the world. Now, isn't that cool?
Hello, and welcome back to the S.M.I.L.E-ing Boys Podcast. Today's episode will be following on from the previous episode on the money and wealth happiness pillar. And today we're going to be delving further into this pillar in relation to a particular theme around young people spending, coming in contact with £100, how easy or how not easy that is for these young people in question, the young Black boys I've been working with, and in particular kind of delving into the relativity of money, its usage, and also the structures that kind of keep the capitalism in place and how that may impact the way that young people are growing up and accustomed to commodification and the materialism that is continually rife in our culture, how that is connected to the issues of youth violence and how that plays out, particularly in this demographic. So as always, the episode begins with a string of research, quotes, and facts that kind of add some further context to the concept we're going to explore as the episode progresses. So just to kind of share some insight around research around money and happiness. As we are probably all aware of this term, money can't buy you happiness, or can it? I guess we're going to explore that much deeper. But when we look at the research, we cannot avoid the fact that wealth does have an impact on happiness. Money is no guarantee for happiness, but a lack of money can easily lead to unhappiness. And this is really interesting when we start to think about the question and the themes around inequality and actually what that brings about when we think about unhappiness and how much of that is linked to money. So while wealth has a definite impact on our happiness, who we compare ourselves to and what we use our wealth for are also key elements to our happiness. Let's take South Korea for example. South Korea is an interesting case study in how a country who was kind of steeped in a lot of poverty over 2-3 generations did so well to boost their economy and increase their GDP to the point where they're one of the richest and wealthiest countries in the world currently. And as a byproduct of that, what we have seen is an increase in life expectancy. So they are one of the highest in the life expectancy rates across the OECD countries. They also have increased their healthcare efficiency, and they also have one of the highest percentages of university graduates across the world. So these, by a lot of standards, are incredible achievements, especially within a space of time, which is, 2 generations, which is not a lot of time. So that's quite remarkable. But on the offshoot of that, what we have seen in South Korea, as an example, is we have also seen that they rank 55 in the world happiness reports as of 2017, 2018. So actually, even though all these kind of economic markers have been hit as an improvement, but actually this does not translate to the improvement of their citizens and therefore rising higher in their happiness reports. Also, what we do see is they are one of the highest suicide rates amongst the OECD countries as well. So what we do see again is that even though there's an increase in the GDP and the economic thriving of the country, this is not related to the actual mental well-being improvement and happiness index of their citizens. So that's a very interesting kind of report that kind of helps us map out, how much this correlation between wealth and happiness really interplays in everyday life. Happiness researchers suggest that it is the relative income, not the absolute income, that is important in our society. There's something termed the hedonic treadmill. I mentioned that in the last episode. And what that is essentially is the fact that as human beings, we have been socialized to the point where we always search for the next goal, no matter what that goal is. If we have kind of set ourselves a task and we have ambition and we want to be able to, buy a house when I'm 32, right? And by the time you get to 32, you already buy that house. When you get to that point, you would assume that you've reached the zenith of happiness, but then you raise the bar again and say, okay, I want to buy my second house when I'm 35, or I want to be able to then have a wife and have a set of children. And then you raise the bar into that and think that's going to bring you happiness, and you get to that point and you raise the bar again. So what it does is we are on this treadmill of consistent ambitions that are raised in different marker points that are supposed to denote our levels of happiness, but actually we never get there because we keep shifting the bar more and more. So that's something that's really fascinating that has kind of been termed by researchers as the hedonic treadmill. And it's important to be aware of that in our lifestyle and the way that we live, and how this impacts the ways in which we set goals, targets, and align our ambitions. And what's also important is, as an offshoot of that, the law of diminishing marginal utility is like an economic term that's used to describe the idea that when we derive happiness from acquiring something, the more of that thing we get, the less happiness and satisfaction we get from it. So it's called the law of diminished marginal utility. So therefore, I love, for example, I always loved Jordans. And the more and more Jordans I continue to accumulate, one would assume that I will continually stay happy or even happier, but actually the more I continually purchase, the less happier, the less satisfied, the less gratifying it is to me. So it's also really trying to be aware of that within ourselves, that more is not always better. And the more we achieve, actually, the desire and the joy and the value we get from that thing continually diminishes the more we purchase these things. What's really important to then kind of explore around that is there's an interesting law. I say law as it's not something that's ironclad or passed in a bill, but it does kind of invisibly form a law in a lot of Nordic countries, especially Denmark. And it's called the law of Janté. Okay, so this law is based upon a book which was published in 1839, and this basically is about, the key thing about the law is you are no better than us. And the whole idea of the law is speaking on class and speaking about the higher classes that exist at that time, and getting people in the Nordic countries to acknowledge and to abide by this idea that no matter how rich you are, no matter how high a class you are, you're no better than anybody else. And that law, of course, there's a lot of problematic elements around the law in terms of how that interplays around different race and class values, but actually the underlying and underpinning value of this law is that nobody is better than another person. This law is now interpreted in a lot of Nordic countries in the idea that no matter how rich people are, people tend to not aspire for increased commodification and capitalism as a way to flaunt their successes, because everyone believes and should aspire to this idea that everyone should not feel like they are better, or they should be treated better, or they should be more valued in the society because of what they're able to achieve financially. That's why very rarely would you go to most Nordic countries and see Lamborghinis just parked on the streets, or seeing, Ferraris and all these kind of markers of financial success as ways of denoting the amounts of success that have been achieved in those societies by these individuals. So that's something that's really interesting, again, to really think about how societal interpretations of the idea of money and wealth really interplays in the ways in which that manifests. So with all that being said, I kind of used a lot of these ideas to create workshops to explore these themes with the young people. And one particular question that I asked these young people around the theme of money and happiness was specifically asking them how easy was it for them to access £100. And that was a very interesting kind of element that I wanted to use to denote the potential inequalities that exist in society in terms of the accessibility these young people have to that amount of money, and also the levels of innovation, but also an insight into the kinds of risk factors that are readily available for these groups of young people in their communities. So I'm going to play you a clip that kind of explores some of these things. Obviously, we generally have a no snitching policy within the group. So some of the things that they explored were off camera, and off audio, some things specifically that perhaps were a bit much more incriminating, but on the surface level, a lot of the other things that they said, they were happy for that to be included. So I'm just gonna play the clip, you have a listen, and then we'll kind of delve further in after that.
£100 in a week.
That's not hard.
Is it easy for you to make £100?
Yeah, there's ways.
Alright, what are the ways?
Go OT.
Yeah? And you make £100 real easy. You can go OT, and that's easy, you think?
It's hard, but you get a lot of money. I have easy access to it, but I wouldn't do it.
Right, but the easy access is there.
Yeah.
And are there any risks if you choose that way to make £100 for you? What are the risks?
If you lose, the food, and you get caught in the trap, or you can get arrested or killed.
Bank fraud.
You can bank fraud, yeah, and that's easy for you.
As long as you have a credit card and a phone and a computer, you can bank fraud.
Okay, so I can imagine how interesting that would have been to listen to a bunch of young people talk somewhat explicitly about what access they have to achieving £100. And what's super interesting, in one group there was a particular young person that was a white young boy who wanted to be part of the session, and in that particular instance I made a concession for him to be part of the sessions. And it's so interesting what his account was of making £100, and he said he would just ask his dad, which was super interesting in comparison to a lot of the other young people. So yeah, let's kind of delve into this particular case study of young people. One of them said they'll go OT, and for most people that might not know what that means, OT means out of town, and out of town is a terminology to describe the county lines structure of drug trade, also a way of describing young people who are leaving the particular city into a much more rural part of town to get involved in drug houses and kind of distribution of drugs to more rural areas. So that is an opportunity that if you are involved in working with young people, you know, that is somewhat of a pandemic in itself in terms of how that impacts a lot of young black boys and young boys from this demographic who are lured and coerced and exploited into these trades by offering financial remuneration to these young boys as a reward. So in this particular instance, a couple of young boys talked about the fact that they have easy access to OT, and so therefore they know drug leaders and gang members who are readily available and waiting for them to make the acceptance of the offer to go OT for a couple of weeks to be involved in creating the process of making the drugs or distribution of the drugs out of town. And they come back, and they probably come back to a healthy sum of money, of which £100 is one of the byproducts of that for these particular young people. And what that's really showing in this particular instance was just the ready accessibility. Even though this young person, you know, through conversation said, you know, he wouldn't do that because he understands the risk factors. But there's a lot of other young people that start off on that mindset of knowing the risk factors, but then based on a lot of other factors around how capitalism plays a role in the world that we live in, the environments that they live in, how easily accessible they are to these things that offer them capitalistic buy-in. You know, the fact that everybody around them is wearing Jordans or wearing Nikes or wearing the latest, you know, Nike tracksuit, and they want to be part of this. And therefore their parents are maybe not able to afford this due to a lot of socioeconomic factors. Their parents are working hard to pay for the basic necessities. So how do they then fit into the society that values financial capitalistic commodities? How do they fit into that? You know, how do they not willingly participate in the social death that would perhaps be awaiting them when they step into the world without any of these trappings? And that's where there's a big piece of work that needs to be done in terms of trying to raise young people and raise young boys and not a fixed value to these other things, because a lot of the things around the society does such a great job at doing that. And we're going to kind of break into some of those things at a later point. But it's just really interesting to start to think around that and how easily preyed on these young boys are by that golden carrot, and how the role of a lot of other, you know, male figures and gang members is very pertinent in this narrative of how money interplays in communities of social deprivation, communities with low socioeconomic intake. All of these factors are really prevalent, and there's still so much studies at the moment that's really trying to explore how this COVID-19 and how this social distancing is impacting the drug trade, and how this is really going to then interplay on the key players on the street level, the young kids who are involved in this. What are going to be a lot of the byproducts of this on that drug economy? Who's going to take the bigger fall, and what are going to be some of the demands? Which ways is there going to be a change in the drug dynamic in the industry in itself. So that's something that's really interesting. There's been a lot of comparative studies with the last time when there was a huge economic disaster in our society in 2008 and how that really played a part in the drug industry. But what we cannot make a direct comparison with is the fact that, the actual import of drugs has been affected in this, because a lot of flights and all of these things that have been canceled. So actually, in comparison to 2008, there were still flights and all these other things, but now there isn't any of that. So actually, what would be the substitutes for the drug trade, and what would be the things that would be used in this case to impact young people? So there's so many interesting things to kind of come out of that in the long term, but in the current moment, it's about just really thinking about how this really interplays in the lives of young people on a regular basis. Another thing that was mentioned with the young people, because what I try and do always is trying to get them to speak honestly without judgment, and that's a very important thing I find, especially in terms of allowing young people to come to their own conclusions themselves by leading them through provocative and critical thinking inclined questions. So asking them about the risks and what are some of the things that could happen to them, and a lot of them are very, very clear and very aware of what these risks are, and you would know that based on that they are able to weigh it up and understand that actually risk versus reward, maybe that's not really viable for me. But actually, when you think about what leads to a lot of these decisions that we make, that even though we know the risks in them, we think because we are in desperate situations. And actually, what does desperate look like for a young person from this demographic? Desperate doesn't have to get to the point where they literally have no food to eat before they think, oh my God, I need to find a way to do something, in which case there are some that are in that situation, but mostly desperate takes different forms in different groups and different times in our lives. And actually, for a young person who's 13, desperate might look like I'm walking down the block and I know that there's drug sales that happens along my pathway to school, and I consistently have to walk through there, and this person keeps asking me every time, yo, you're gonna do that for me, you're gonna go drop this over for me in this place, or you're gonna go on a trip for me. That young person consistently having the willpower to say no and to say no, but having to consistently do that, getting to the point where maybe that might escalate and somebody beat him up or something else, that becomes desperate for that young person. And all of a sudden they think, well, instead of getting beaten up, I might as well just earn some money, and I'm a bit slick, I can get away with this, I can get away with that. Or desperate could look like a young person who is consistently shamed in school because they are not cool, because they don't have this, they don't have that, and they've been wearing this Dunlops that their mom got them because that's all she can afford. And he's getting beaten up, he's getting his bag laughed at and thrown at him in class and things like that. And again, because the model that we have been sold is this model that you as a young person, you as a person, especially black boys, so black masculinity is strongly tied to the idea of commodification. And I'm just going to read an excerpt from a Black Masculinity Under Racial Capitalism essay by Jordana Malton. And this excerpt is basically saying, if conventional routes to masculine worth via virtuous breadwinning are unavailable, the freedom to make money any way possible and spend it with abandon emerges as a generalizable expression of manhood, especially black manhood. And this ties all the way back to a lot of social structures that are in place, which no doubt are tied to the colonial and slave era. And that's really interesting in terms of the fact that in most places, if these young boys are modeled the idea that actually most young people don't have equal access, or most their parents or their uncles or their family don't have equal access to this breadwinning status in their places of work. In order to be valued in the society, economy and capitalism, the trappings of those two things are used to affix worth and value to a particular person. So if you cannot achieve that value through going into places of work where you are promoted as readily as the white counterpart, and you are able to earn as much as those and be able to thrive in a society and move out of the communities that are without a lot of provisions, then you would find a way to be able to have an equal stake in the pie, which again is a byproduct of how patriarchy teaches us to aspire for those things. So for you to get an equal piece of the pie, you have to then find by any means ways in which you can make that income to be able to equally be seen as a person of value. And therefore, being openly exposed to these ideas and these models and the ways in which it interplays in their family, our movies that we watch and our examples of success and a lot of male role models and other people in the society that we herald as some of the most incredible achievers, all these things then interplay in the lives of a young child by modeled behavior to think, okay, so for me to equally get value and be able to be respected and to be seen in the society as somebody who's of worth, then I need to be able to have these things and make this money so I can then be amongst the cool, be amongst the accepted and the valued. And that therein lies the challenge that we face as a society, and how to disentangle worth and value from capitalism and money, specifically capitalism in this case. And that is a big task. And another young person talked about banging fraud and how it's so easy for them to do that. They just need a computer or a phone or credit card, and therefore their resourceful and innovative ways come into play in that, because then these young people are then told to go out and scour the internet or scour everywhere else for credit card numbers and bring it back to these people that then give them a cut, and they have access to that, and there's a lot of other things that were discussed, which were very scary in terms of how readily accessible these things are to the young people at the age of 13, and how it takes a great deal of willpower, a great deal of discipline, a great deal of moral aligning compass positively, and also a great deal of great positive modeling of somebody in that young person's life to circumvent them from these pathways because they are readily available to them. And that was something that really kind of made me take a step back and really try to explore and understand how we can put things in place to safeguard these young people and to kind of model a different version of what value looks like in their everyday lives. One of the things I'm going to kind of highlight in terms of an outtake from this and how we can put things in place is trying to foster a society, but starting from home and starting from your immediacy, a society that values the happiness in the pursuit as opposed to pursuing happiness as the golden trophy at the end, seeing the actual pursuit as the thing to be happy in, because in that way we get off the hedonic treadmill. Because if the goal of what you're chasing is you are able to buy this, until you buy that, you don't think you've reached happiness, and then you have to move that on to the next thing when you've achieved that, because actually the happiness doesn't come because you want the other thing. But actually, if the pursuit is what brings about happiness, the fact that you have to do something that you love to be able to earn some money to maybe be able to buy that car, but if you enjoy what you're doing, at the end of the day, even if you don't buy that car, that thing that you're doing is consistently bringing you happiness and it's bringing you value and it's bringing you acknowledgement within that industry or within that thing that you're doing, then that in itself should be sufficient. That in itself should be something that allows you to feel like there is a sense of value, there's a sense of accomplishment within what we are actually aspiring for. So that's kind of one of the things that I think is important to kind of explore when we're thinking about that. Another thing is really trying to think about what ways can we provide access for this young people from this demographic to get equal share and access into creative industries, into industries where they can actually positively harness these skill sets that are equally used in the drug industry, in the gang industry, which is incredible sense of economic innovation, problem solving, lots of all these transferable skills that, believe me, being around young people in prison and they telling me some of the things they did and how they got caught, I'm sitting there thinking, what? You've been running this for like 4 years or 6 months or whatever without getting caught, and like the levels of ingenuity, the levels of intricate, thinking, the levels of like structures, then I'm like, man, if you had a good teacher that told you that these skill sets could get you into creating this and starting this business and doing that, you would possibly think about this world that you're living in very differently, because actually there will be less risks, but you'll be able to use the same innovations that you use in this particular industry that's illegal into something that is actually quite incredible. And that's something that, a lot of those young people, first time they've ever heard that, somebody say that to them, it's the first time that somebody's ever made them realize that those skill sets are incredibly valued in a lot of these industries, but actually they just don't see people that look like them there. They don't see people that have come through particular similar backgrounds as them in these environments that actually can show that there is a tangibility to this idea, to this dream for them. But also it's really important to disassociate that from this idea of achievability politics, that I've done it. I've come from your neighborhood, you could do it too, because it's never that simple. And often, in most cases, that's probably one of the exceptions to the rules. It's about trying to find a balance between that and getting young people to really understand that, as long as the journey in itself is what is designed to bring you happiness in your core, then you can start to focus more on that, and everything else will be a trap, and everything else will be a byproduct of that. And that's something that's really important to really try and explore with the young people. Another thing that's really important in our own everyday lives to explore is to think about, again, how much have we consumed in various media that gives us a very skewed, stereotypical perspective of this demographic when we think about the reasons behind, why, capitalism or money is a big, goal for a lot of these young people. Again, how much of us are responsible for creating, media, music, films, art that perpetuates narratives like this, that actually makes it then eventually a self-fulfilling prophecy, because young people see this and look, okay, that's what I should aspire for, that's how I should make this, that's how I should make that. So just being very critical in the way that we create medium that perpetuates these narratives, then actually also forms an institutional bias, because people start to look at these young people and look at us and think, oh yeah, that's what they like. Every time they get a bit of money, they want to buy this, they want to do that, they want to show that. And actually, how can we disentangle this ideology that is inherently false and really problematic in terms of how that is affixed to a whole race of people, and also within that, important to challenge those ideas within ourselves, because those two things can absolutely exist, and it's important to really kind of explore that with nuance, especially amongst ourselves, and especially while exploring the conversations like this with young people. So last thing I'm going to do a quick experiment, which is like a social piece that has been kind of done over the years to kind of get us to really think about something that's super interesting and how we kind of play a part in this thinking process. Because I asked the young people this question when I explore this concept of money with. So I give them two scenarios. I said, in one world, if you were making 50 grand and everybody else was making 25 grand, that's the first world, right? You were making 50 grand in this world and everybody else was making 25. And in the second world, you were making 100 grand, but everybody else was making 200 grand. And the relative price of everything stays the same in both worlds. So for example, Netflix subscription is still, for the premium, $11.99 in both worlds. Okay, so the first world, you were making 50 grand and everybody else was making 25. The second world, you were making 100 grand and everybody else was making 200 grand. Which world would you rather be in? That's a very honest question to ask ourselves and think about it for a few seconds. So the answer that has kind of predominantly formed the percentage of research that has been gathered over the years that this has been done is majority, over 50%, would rather be in the first world, the world where you earn 50 and everybody else earn 25. Like, that's so interesting to think about what the masses and the populace of us often kind of think about and how we aspire to exist, is this idea of relativity. Because then, as one of the young people said in the last episode, that then it doesn't make it enjoyable then if I buy a car because everybody else can afford it. And this idea that the reason why my value should be heralded as one to aspire for is because I'm the only one that has the ability to have these things or to achieve these things. And actually, if you take that away in the second world, where you are earning much more but everybody else is earning more than you, and you would rather choose the previous word. And that's so interesting. Obviously, it would be really interesting to hear in the comments what your own ideas of the world that you would rather live in is, and genuinely and honestly exploring that within yourself, because I think that's really fascinating, and I had to really think about that a lot within myself. And in most cases, when I do this social experiment exercise with a lot of young people, they mainly choose the first world, and it's so fascinating and interesting to explore and to think about that. With that being said, I just wanted to kind of hope that a lot of things that I explored around money and wealth and how that impacts our everyday lives, how that impacts the lives of young people, and what role we can play in trying to model a world that's different, a model of world that affixes value to not just commodities and capitalistic trappings, but actually one that affixes value to the skill set, that affixes value to the journey, the pursuit of this happiness that might eventually lead to more money or maybe not. So thank you guys for being avid listeners of the show. I really appreciate your commitment to listening. So do share, do rate, do comment, do debate it. And I would love to hear all your thoughts. Thank you for being part of another incredible S.M.I.L.E.ing Boys podcast episode. I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Peace and love.